Hi, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us this evening for our latest Unsafe for Scrutiny event. How unchecked kleptocracy is undermining media freedom and eroding democracy. Pretty important topics that we're pleased that as part of our Unsafe for Scrutiny project here at the Foreign Policy Centre, we're able to deliver in partnership with our partners, the Justice for Journalists Foundation. My name is Susan Coftry, I'm Project Director, but I'm delighted to say that our chair this evening, who will be introducing our fantastic panel, is Dame Margaret Hodge. Dame Margaret has been the MP for Barking and Dagenham since 1994. She's a member of the Labour Party and she previously served as leader of the Islington Borough, London Borough Council from 1982 to 1992. She's held a number of ministerial roles and crucially served as the first female chair of the Public Accounts Committee from 2010 to 2015. Her time as the PAC chair has led her to chair an APPG on responsible tax and vigorously campaign for tax justice, and may I say also on anti-corruption. So we're really delighted to have her with us. Just a reminder, please, if you want to engage in the discussion, and we really hope you do, please put your questions in the Q&A box on Zoom, and there'll be an opportunity to ask a question after all the panelists have spoken. But for now, please let me hand over the virtual floor to Dame Margaret.
Thanks so much, and thank you, Susan, for organising this event, where we've got four completely brilliant speakers who I think will provoke, I hope, a very interesting discussion. So we've got an hour and a half, and I'm going to get on immediately with introducing them. The emphasis tonight, what was the title for tonight's event is how unchecked kleptocracy is undermining media freedom and eroding democracy. And I've had the privilege of talking to some of the contributors today. I know that they will stimulate us. My all-party parliamentary group is focusing heavily on kleptocracy, how oligarchs, autocrats and dictators who steal from the people of their own country and embezzle public funds simply to either enrich themselves, their families, or their friends. And our interest is very much in how, having done that, they then shift the money out of their countries into the mainstream through money laundering and complex financial mechanisms. What is important is that their stolen money goes into the mainstream, but what is also important is that very often it's poor, struggling countries that lose the resources they desperately need to tackle many of the issues of poverty and inequality that exist in their communities. So there are huge facets to this that I think those of us in jurisdictions like the UK or like the USA should be taking seriously. So I look forward to the contributions that we have tonight on those issues and the actions that people like me sitting in a legislature ought to be taking. I'm going to start immediately with Catherine Belton, who is one of my heroines. She's an investigative investigative correspondent. She worked for Reuters, but I know her through a book that she published called Putin's People, which is focused on how the KGB took back Russia and then took on the West. It was published by HarperCollins last year. Worked as Moscow correspondent for the Financial Times for 6 years, from 2007 to 2013. And in 2016, she was the newspaper's legal correspondent. She's reported on Russia for the Moscow Times and for Business Week. She was shortlisted for Business Journalist of the Year at the British Press Awards and was the 2021 winner of the Magnitsky Award for Outstanding Investigative Journalism, a well-deserved accolade. Her book was a Sunday Times bestseller, the New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice, and the Daily Telegraph Book of the Year. Catherine, over to you to talk to us.
Thanks so much, Margaret, for such a brilliant introduction. And I'm very honoured to be here and speaking in such company, especially at a time when media freedom and public interest journalism is becoming ever more important. I wanted to sort of begin briefly with what I was trying to do in my book. I wanted to show really how kleptocracy was becoming a threat to the democracies of the Western world, specifically through the story of the rise to power of Putin and his former KGB cronies. I wanted to show how once they've been able to seize control of the country's strategic cash flows through subverting its court system and arresting its once richest man and then installing their own loyal allies in place of the more independent Yeltsin era tycoons, Putin's Kremlin could then use the tens of billions of dollars, if not hundreds of billions of dollars at its command to try and reassert its role on the world stage. Now, Putin's Kremlin wanted to do this not by competing with other economies as a great and competitive economy, but by seeking to corrupt and undermine its rivals in the West and to divide and destabilize them. And so this really kind of gets to the nub of why kleptocracy is a problem in the West, because for so many years there've been a bit of a lackadaisical approach to kleptocracy, and I'm sure you've battled with this for many years. It's never really been seen as a threat or a security threat in any way. Indeed, if there are corrupt cash flows being siphoned out of Russia, in fact, it would weaken Russia. And it seemed to be that the more Putin and his allies were stealing, then surely the weaker the Russian economy and the less of a threat it was. So it seemed to me that the West was collectively closing its eyes and opening its arms to corrupt cash flows, particularly from Russia, and indeed was making a great deal of money out of it. We all know how the City of London has thrived on many of these cash flows, which have been enjoyed by law firms and bankers and many other in the financial industry. And in doing so, though, people were forgetting the playbook, the KGB playbook of the past. And if you look at how the KGB operated in the 70s and 80s, they used intermediaries and front companies to fund influence operations, to fund their political allies in other countries. And it became clear that Putin and his allies were trying to replicate this model, only now they had sort of gazillions more dollars at their command now that they made the transition to the market and then subsequently taken control of the economy. So the West had thought there was nothing left for Russia to do but to integrate into the Western rules-based global order. And so the more Russian cash in the Western system there was, the more that Russia would have to behave as the West did. But in fact, the opposite happened. Russia was able to take advantage of the lax regulation and lack of transparency in Western markets, and as well as Western greed in our financial institutions and political systems to corrupt institutions in the West and divide our democracies. Now, Thomas Piketty has estimated there's some $800 billion in Russian cash stashed away offshore. And this is more than the wealth of the entire Russian population holds at home. One of Putin's closest allies, Vladimir Yakunin, has said that if in the Yeltsin era this cash stashed offshore was outside of the control of the Kremlin, now the tables have turned, that the Kremlin can command it. And we've already seen as well our own Parliament's Security and Intelligence Committee point out how the West has been caught napping essentially to how this pays a risk, and that the attention of our security services was turned post 9/11 to the terrorist threat. And because of this, now we see that it's increasingly important to boost transparency. And the report of the Parliament Security and Intelligence Committee also points out how Russian business figures here are used often in conjunction with Russian intelligence to buy and win influence within the UK political system and within other Western democracies. And in fact, they've said that these are so deeply embedded now, it's very difficult to untangle the kind of the broad influence that many of these figures now have. Of course, you know, of course, that we need greater scrutiny of political donors, greater transparency and greater resources now for law enforcement to examine this. Casey Michel, in his book, he's written a lot about how the states in the US rushed to open their doors to a lot of illicit cash because they could make money through welcoming them to kind of create shell companies and so on. But it's clear to me that the UK economy doesn't really benefit from any of the shell companies used by these corrupt individuals. We've heard of the Deutsche Bank mirror trade scheme. We've heard of the Moldovan laundromat and the tens of billions of dollars that flooded through Danske Bank, most of them through shell companies in the UK, through limited liability partnerships. But none of the cash going through these companies ever touches the economy. Companies' house might make a few pennies here and there on the registration fees, but the cash doesn't come in any way in investment into our company. It just contributes to very opaque cash flows, which eventually may find its way into our political system. And one of the most concerning things for me when I was investigating and doing the research for my book was that sort of many of the individuals behind these well-known money laundering schemes that have since been uncovered are kind of a part of an overlapping network of senior FSB officials. So a lot of the tens of billions of dollars of cash that are coming through those shell companies, it's mostly customs and tax evasions, which is robbing treasuries of revenue, but within those cash flows hidden away, layered in it are the interests of the FSB, and we can't trace where it's going through. A lot of the money may be going to hedge funds, which, as Casey knows very well, don't have to disclose at all the source of their clients' money or kind of anything, but barely have to have any disclosure at all. So it's really important that we kind of start boosting transparency. And most of all, it's really critical at this time that the press is free to examine all these goings on. Not quite sure what annoyed so many people in the Kremlin and in the Russian oligarch world about my book, but as you know, that since publication, almost a year after it came out, I and my publishers HarperCollins were hit with 5 lawsuits. 4 of them have since been withdrawn. One remains, which has been filed by Roman Abramovich. I can't comment on this while it's still ongoing, but one of the cases which was filed by the Kremlin oil company is really a case in point on how abusive some of these claims can be, which are basically aimed at intimidating journalists out of investigating areas of public interest. The claim that Rosneft filed was filed very late. Our QC has argued that the entire case should be thrown out of court, that it was nakedly a put-up job, that Rosneft, the Kremlin oil champion, shouldn't be used to front claims that should have been filed by individuals in the Kremlin, like Igor Sechin, the former deputy chief of staff. He said the case doesn't pass the threshold of seriousness because the main claim centered around allegations that Rosneft was involved in the expropriation of Yukos, which is Russia's once biggest oil company. And this is something that had been aired many, many times in the press before, and also in the international litigation for which there's a ruling against the Kremlin that it did indeed expropriate this oil company. So thankfully, our UK court system has been working quite fairly, and the judge in our case threw most of this claim out of court, and Rosneft agreed to withdraw its remaining claim. But it was really an example of how some of these individuals involved in kleptocratic practices are trying to abuse our legal systems to intimidate journalists. I have a former colleague, Tom Burgess, who's an investigative journalist at the FT, who's facing a very, very similar claim, where again, a company, ENRC, which is a Kazakh company, is being used as a front for a claim which should have been filed by the individual shareholders of the company. And it should, as far as I understand, it's a statute of UK law that companies can't be used as a front for claims that should be filed by individuals. trials. And these center over allegations that the shareholders were involved in the suspicious deaths of whistleblowers involved in looking into kind of deep-seated corruption that the company was allegedly involved in. And there's no such statute as corporate murder, and yet a holding company from the ENRC has come out all guns blazing and filed these very intimidating claims against my colleague Tom Burgess. And thankfully for me and for him, HarperCollins is a very robust publisher, and we're very lucky to be with them, because many of my colleagues don't have such deep-pocketed and strong publishers and editors and legal teams, and very often they really do face a great danger now of being threatened into self-censorship by deep-pocketed oligarchs. And I'll stop there because there's a lot more to say by other people.
Thanks, Catherine, and all power to you for having to deal with that, where hopefully lots of people are behind you and supporting you through what is undoubtedly an appallingly difficult process of litigation. But I would recommend the book to anybody who's interested in kleptocracy, and with the role of Putin in that. I should have said at the beginning, we're meeting on International Anti-Corruption Day. And we are also meeting on the day that Biden is running his summit on democracy. And before coming on this call, I listened to our own Prime Minister giving various, again, commitments to greater transparency and toughening up the regulation and policing it more strongly. Translating that into reality is something I will try and hold him to account. But it's an appropriate date for us to talk. Thank you, Catherine, that's brilliant. Casey, Michelle, I don't know, but when I read your CV, Casey, Casey's talking to us from Washington?
New York City.
New York, right.
Yes, not far.
So it's great that online seminars of this nature can bring us all together from across the world. He too is a fantastic investigative journalist with a great and proud history. He's worked on topics like kleptocracy, illicit finance, foreign interference to developments in the post-Soviet space, and the dark money financing networks, which is very similar to our interest and that of Catherine. He has written a book called American Kleptocracy: How the US Created the World's Greatest Money Laundering Scheme in History. I think the Brits come a close second, if not a first. And he has written for a whole range of publications, from the Washington Post to the Guardian to the National Review and to Politico. He's also a member of the Advisory Council for the Hudson Institute's Kleptocracy Initiative, where he helps to co-host the Making a Killing podcast on corruption and kleptocracy. Casey, I look forward to hearing from you.
Well, thank you so very much for that generous introduction, Dame Margaret. Thank you, Susan, obviously, for organizing this, Susan and Poppy, as well. It is, needless to say, an honor to be here with everyone today. Again, I am calling from beautiful New York City here in the U.S. As you may be able to tell from my accent, I am a proud American national. So I'll be discussing maybe a little bit more of the American side of things today. And I will say, just to preface this, I know, Dame Margaret, you were just mentioning today is International Anti-Corruption Day. Today is President Biden's organized Summit for Democracy. You know, we're here on Thursday. We have one more day in the week. It has already been a truly unprecedented week, at least in the U.S., in terms of all things kleptocracy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've seen over the past few days, maybe place it in a greater context. Obviously, what Catherine was just describing, the broader phenomenon of modern kleptocracy. Certainly, as I argue in my book, the U.S. is one of, if not the greatest offshore havens and sources of these pro-kleptocracy industries. It's a very unfortunate competition. Maybe the U.S. is the greatest. Maybe it's the U.K. It's, as we call it, a race to the bottom. And unfortunately, nobody ends up winning except for the kleptocrats and maybe a few enablers here in the U.S. and the U.K. along the way. But I wanted to start just at the top, just to run through some of the developments we've seen just in the past few days, which is why I think this panel itself is really so timely. I'm going to fall short. I'm not going to get through everything we've seen in just the past few days because I'm already drowning in the news just trying to keep up. Right here in the US, we have seen in just the past few days proposed rulemaking for beneficial ownership for things like American shell companies. We have seen proposed rulemaking for anonymous money in real estate. Obviously, I'm sure we'll be talking more about the role of real estate in these transnational illicit financial networks. But most impressively, we have seen out of the White House a brand new strategy document on countering corruption. Now, this document is nearly 40 pages. It's not over long, but it is packed with more material, more policy proposals, and a more concise and forward-leaning, forward-thinking single document than, frankly, I've ever seen in American history, and certainly I would argue is unlike anything we have seen in the US. It's really this kind of laundry list of all things anti-corruption and counter kleptocracy. It has everything from strengthening the international architecture to fight against kleptocracy to even just recognizing that the US itself has transformed into this gargantuan source of all things offshoring. And oh, by the way, it does specifically single out American lawyers, American real estate agents, American auction houses, really calling to task the American professionals, these enablers that open the sources, open the access to the Western, and in this case, American financial system that, as we know, leads to modern kleptocracy. It really is difficult to overstate how much of a watershed this week has really been in terms of at least the American fight against kleptocracy. It really feels like the culmination of so many years of work, so many civil society groups, so many politicians, political voices, and obviously incredible journalists like Catherine here today who have sacrificed so much of their time and their effort to shining a light on this phenomenon. And I'm going to put a quick plug in here. This is maybe a shameless self-plug, but just yesterday, taking my American hat off and maybe putting the UK one on. Chatham House, I was involved in a brand new paper that was released from Chatham House just yesterday, looking specifically at the UK context and again, how post-Soviet elite and kleptocratic figures out of places like Russia, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, etc., what kind of damage these networks have done to specifically UK rule of law, and again, looking specifically at things like libel tourism. So between the White House document and the new Chatham House paper, I know I'm giving folks plenty of reading material moving forward. But again, get back to the American side of things. We have been absolutely giddy over the past few days. I do want to say much of it is still in the realm of rhetoric. We have yet to see the actual policy implementations, but the actual rhetorical framing is there. Again, this is what we have been pushing for, what we've been advocating for. This is a moment and a week and a time unlike any in recent American history, and frankly, unlike anything we've really seen since the days of Watergate in the 1970s and the aftermath of the Nixon presidency. But given that we are talking specifically about the threats of kleptocracy to investigative journalists, to media freedoms, there's two elements of the new strategy from the White House that I wanted to highlight in particular, both of which I'm sure we'll be talking about more of today. Again, in the U.S., we have First Amendment protections, which again offer broad protections to investigative journalists, among others. But at least that's how it's supposed to work in theory, because much as we have seen in other jurisdictions, other countries, other areas of the world, there have been increasing threats to the First Amendment in recent years from both Americans and non-Americans alike. We don't yet have this broader phenomenon, or at least such a pointed phenomenon of libel tourism in the U.S., but there does remain a lack of a federal anti-SLAPP statute. In the U.S., as it pertains to SLAPP regulations and legislation, it's not coming from the federal level. In many ways, it's similar to shell company creation. There's no federal oversight whatsoever. It is up to the states to create, to craft, refine, and then resource their own SLAPP statutes. But even when those SLAPP statutes do exist at a state level, they can, and in many cases, especially in recent years, will be watered down. We've seen this most especially out of one of the major American states, Texas, in which their state-level SLAPP statute was watered down in recent years. So the U.S. does have a fractured SLAPP landscape. There has been increased discussion in Congress about a federal anti-SLAPP statute, but we're not there yet. But that brings me back to this new White House document and why it is so, I mean, I will say it's phenomenal to read through, and I know I've recommended it already, but if anybody has free 20 minutes, go through, take a look. But there's one part that I wanted to highlight initially from the document that's directly supporting journalists, especially investigative journalists, and recognizing the role that journalists play in unwinding and highlighting these kleptocratic networks. I'll just quote from the document here. the White House says, quote, the United States will deploy new and existing programming to respond to rapidly evolving threats to and harassment of reformers, journalists, and other anti-corruption change agents. For example, USAID, which is one of the primary aid and development funding agencies in the U.S., is working on the creation of a defense-only liability coverage to investigative reporters and their organizations in the event of defamation claims. And again, we've seen this already echoed from high-level American officials. It's not just in the document. They're actually publicly discussing this as well, highlighted especially by Samantha Power, who is the USAID chief. So that's one part, this new defense-only liability coverage that they are planning. The second part that I wanted to cite is related to that. And this section is it's literally called Countering Strategic Lawsuits Against Public Participation, or SLAPP. And it says, quote, departments and agencies will work to counter nuisance suits against journalists and activists, and will seek additional authorities, working with Congress if needed, to advance anti-SLAPP programs and policies. When possible, the United States will coordinate actions with partner countries taking similar steps. So obviously the first one that I mentioned, looking at a specific fund, a specific defense only liability coverage fund. This one looking more strategically, forcing or requesting all agencies within the executive branch to examine their own potential capabilities for strengthening these anti-SLAPP regulations, funding, organization, and coordination with partner countries and partners elsewhere. So again, so much of this, or in many ways all of this so far, is rhetoric. All of this is simply brand new policy pushes, obviously welcome, but it is words only as of yet. We have to see how this translates into reality and what comes next. But if I do seem a bit giddy or overexcited today, it's not just the coffee, it is everything we've seen over the past few days as well. So I'll stop there. There's more details I can share later, but I've been speaking for long enough.
That's brilliant, Casey. So thank you very much indeed. And it's great to feel your optimism. I must say that having worked in this area for such a long time, I sort of, I'm rather tired of rhetoric, and I am looking for action. So it's really, really important to translate that into action. But we would love to see it here in the UK, and particularly on the anti-SLAPP regulation, which is an issue that actually I haven't personally been engaged with until I sort of started talking to Catherine and others early on. Can we have a link to the document put on the chat, Casey? If you look at the chat, there's somebody who is wanting that. That's brilliant. Great. Thank you for that. That's really, really, really good and optimistic. And let's see what we can learn from that. I'm now going to turn to Maria, and I said I would try and pronounce her surname, but I'm giving up on it, I'm afraid, Maria. But she too has got a brilliant CV that I've got before me. She's now director of the Justice for Journalists Foundations, and that is an eminently sensible organization that does fund journalistic investigations into violent crimes against media workers, and it helps professional journalists and citizen journalists to mitigate the risks that they face when they undertake these investigations. She has had an international career, which has involved designing and managing a number of public awareness of advocacy, human rights, and crisis management campaigns. And as a Secretary General of the EU Russian Center, she oversaw the research of that center and the lobbying efforts into Brussels and the wider European pattern. And she ran the International Litigation, Communication and Advocacy Campaign as the head of the Khodorkovsky Press Center in Russia. She's authored research and articles, and she speaks regularly on subjects including sociological and political trends, international relations, freedom of speech, and global security. Maria, over to you.
Oh, thank you very much for this very lengthy introduction. I really am very pleased and honored to be on this panel today. And hello, my friend Catherine, whom I know from our Moscow work on one of my extensive projects. I was one of the first witnesses of her starting that famous book, which of course is being discussed now all over the world. So today I'm going to speak really a bit about the those quasi-legal methods that are used against journalists in the post-Soviet countries. And I will name the perpetrators behind those methods, the local kleptocrats. Obviously, many of those kleptocrats enjoy residency in the UK and Europe, some of them in the US, which gives them access to international legal services and judicial systems, and hence the relevance to this panel today. So our foundation, Justice for Journalists Foundation, is very much involved in the SLAPS topic, and we have already invested around €250,000 into research and helping the organizations and partners from various countries in Europe, UK, Mexico, Colombia, Armenia to investigate the situation with SLAPS in those countries, and to we also brought together some of those partners from these countries and additional experts and journalists to the first anti-SLAP conference that took place in November. And it was also co-organized with Foreign Policy Center. While this problem of SLAPS is becoming recognized and discussed in countries like the UK, the SLAP mechanism has been widely used to silence the journalists in the post-Soviet region. One would imagine that, of course, in countries like Russia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, etc., the main means of silencing the journalists would be to kill them. It is still a problem. We understand it is still a problem, and we all remember the uninvestigated murders and unpunished crimes which resulted in death of journalists like Paul Klebnikov and Anna Politkovskaya and Natalia Stemiro and many, many others, unfortunately. So this remains a problem, but according to our monitoring of the various types of attacks against media workers, we see that around 63% of all attacks, or roughly 8,000 cases, and we're looking at the 5 last years from 2017. So around 8,000 cases were implemented using various legal and quasi-legal mechanisms. So many authoritarian countries with no independent judiciary system, again, like Belarus, Russia, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, they would simply introduce and implement legislation to altogether ban certain foreign journalists and media outlets. And a lot of them are already banned from working in these countries, like Voice of America, Radio Liberty, BBC, Deutsche Welle, and others. And the pretext for those bans would be interfering into the internal affairs of the state, or distributing fake news, or publishing provocation, or propagating illegal drugs, etc. So obviously, this is for the authoritarian regimes. It's easier to ban the foreign journalists. They just have to leave and close their representative offices in these countries. But the independent in-country journalists remain, and are also being widely persecuted because it turns out that they are now the main and the only remaining opponent of those authoritarian regimes, because the real opposition was all crushed, either forced to emigrate, or put in prison, or murdered as well. So journalists and independent voices are the only really opposing force, and so it is being fought with the help of various methods, including the use of these quasi-legal mechanisms. It is very important to understand that in these countries that I mentioned, the main kleptocrat is the state. The state. So, and all the its agencies, all its officials are vitally interested in keeping their illegal dealings as untransparent, as silent as possible. The main task for those kleptocrats would be to silence independent journalists and citizen bloggers who continue to publicize the truth about the reality behind the legitimate facades of the state institutions, companies, law enforcement agencies, legislators, judges, and other enablers of the kleptocratic autocracies that have emerged following the collapse of the Soviet Union precisely 30 years ago today. Yeah, yesterday. Yeah, 30 years ago. So what are other pretexts and methods that are being used by the state actors to curb media freedom? Again, that would be, the pretext would be fighting terrorism and extremism. It will be insulting a president, like in Belarus, for example. It will be, of course, COVID-19 restrictions, which are widely used all over the world to curb media freedoms, and especially in these countries, interests of the public health and safety. It will be public nuisance, hooliganism, spreading panic, instilling hatred, provoking racial, ethnic, religious, or any other conflict, dissemination of fake information, interference in the country's sovereign affairs, and of course, including journalists in the lists on the vastly and very quickly growing list of so-called foreign agents and undesirable organizations, and essentially deprive the journalists and citizen and professional journalists from majority of their civil rights, including their opportunity to work and earn money, essentially. Among other forms of legal attacks are, of course, defamation and libel legal suits. And the perpetrators would be here usually the state's little helpers, or rather big helpers, which are state-owned corporations such as Rosneft, already mentioned, and Alpha Capital in Russia, Eurasian Natural Resources Corporation in Kazakhstan, SOKA, which is the state-owned company in Azerbaijan, and of course, individual billionaire politicians, members of the parliament, and those businessmen who gained the immense riches thanks to connections with the state officials and the system of property distribution. This is very relevant to this conversation, because many of these people have vast properties in Europe, in the UK, in the States. Some of them enjoy the benefits of the golden visa programs, which are widely used again in UK, in Malta, in Cyprus, in other European countries. We know that some of the people mentioned today, like Abramovich, for example, is still enjoying his list in the top 10 richest people of the UK. He is number 8, although his golden visa was not prolonged, it expired in the 2018 and was not reissued. But as an Israeli citizen, he can travel to the UK freely and still occupies his place in the UK rich list. Another person, the same top 10, is Alisher Usmanov, who is the head of Metallo Invest and the co-owner of Arsenal Football Club, and he's number 6 now with 13.4 billion pounds. So these are the people who are very respected and, of course, very influential inside the UK. Other people are, of course, Aliyev and Pashayev families of Azerbaijan, who own around half billion pounds property portfolio in the UK, and even sold something to one of the properties to the Crown, I believe. There is also SOKA, which is sort of Rosneft of Azerbaijan. So they use their international exposure to sue independent journalists all over the world. Basically, all of those who were able to leave the country, they're being sued and persecuted from inside Azerbaijan, from outside of Azerbaijan, specifically for the information they distribute about this company. Of course, the case against Tom Burgess was already mentioned, so I'm not going to go into that. So very briefly, I think what needs to be done here with all these facts. I think first of all, basically the UK needs, and other countries, they need to acknowledge that there are a lot of interested parties in keeping the status quo, and that's not just the kleptocrats themselves, but of course the bank, who are proactively reaching out to them and have nice business with them, the lawyers who help, and the solicitors and barristers who help them in their dealings, real estate agencies, reputation laundry firms, private detectives, and all sorts of people who are really becoming quite rich while helping these billionaires establish their presence in the global scene. Second, I believe the legislation needs to be devised just to complicate the life of these enablers whom I mentioned, so that they are forced to report and register their clients, and maybe the clients will need to provide as well a certain level of transparency, and the mechanism should be put in place to make this cooperation really transparent and difficult. Third, I think that any legal case brought up against journalists or media worker here in the UK jurisdiction or elsewhere, it needs to be looked through the lens of SLAPS. If it meets the criteria of SLAPS, it needs to be treated very differently from any other case of libel, defamation, or privacy breach case. The solution for dealing with this type of clearly SLAP cases would be to make sure that the costs that are currently absolutely prohibitive for the media, they need to be really significantly lower and really proportionate to that damage that is caused or allegedly caused by the articles and publications. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Brilliant, Maria. Thank you so much. All the issues that you've raised are ones that I'm working on at the moment. And I was just saying, from my point of view, it's just worth saying this, that as parliamentarians, we depend on the journalists, absolutely 100% depend on the investigative journalists to uncover much of what is going on in that dark world of kleptocracy. So I've got huge respect, but also a big dependency on you. What I can do is provide you with a safe space in which we can then reveal stuff in public, which I think is very important. So at least it goes into the public domain and then can be used from speeches we make in a protected environment in Parliament, certainly in the UK, to spread actually the knowledge and understanding of how the kleptocrats work. I just want to add one final thing before I go to Sue. One of the most frightening things I've discovered is not just that money comes in, it comes in through property, it comes in through a whole network and web of companies, but it's now infiltrating our public life. And it's whether it's through both Usmanov and Abramovich doing soft power by buying football clubs, or whether it's by buying into football clubs, or whether it's by actual funding of politicians. And that is the most dangerous, most dangerous. And I just don't think yet there's an appreciation of how that power is being exploited. Sorry, that's me banging on a reflection of what you've said. Sue, Dr. Susan Hawley is the Executive Director on Spotlight on Corruption. And she has been an anti-corruption campaigner, specialist, and for me, guru, working on the issue for 2 decades. I owe enormous debt to her for actually briefing me and supporting me as I develop my knowledge and understanding of the issues and helping. She's got an expertise that's built out of policy, out of research, and as a lawyer, also she has done a lot of work in monitoring court trials and tracking UK enforcement and pushing for greater transparency. Over to you, Sue.
Thanks very much, Margaret. Just to say that you absolutely are guru in all the work you've done in Parliament. I'll come back to that. I was going to take a slightly different tack and look at some of the reasons why the UK is losing the battle against kleptocracy. and against preventing itself being a major enabler of kleptocracy, with a particular focus on the desperate lack of enforcement we have in the UK. I think there's something you've raised again and again, Margaret, not least in Parliament last week. We have some decent laws for the most part, with some notable exceptions, like how Companies House can monitor information and verify people behind companies, who owns foreign owners of property register, the foreign owners of property in the UK, and corporate liability. And Margaret and her colleagues are doing some amazing work on pushing that through. But our laws are relatively okay, but our enforcement is very, very weak. And I just wanted to look at a few reasons behind this and how they kind of overlap a bit with some of the slap stuff against journalists. So the first of the reasons is that in the UK, we're not prepared to prosecute big players or senior executives for their role in kleptocracy and corruption. It's a very, very un-British thing to do. We like to make public-private partnerships, invite people in to come and solve the problem from the private sector, but prosecution is not on the agenda. So just to give you an example of this, we did a comparison back in 2019, comparing how US and UK regulators dealt with money laundering by banks in New York and London. So two comparably sized financial centers. And we found that over 10 years, the US had imposed fines 34 times greater than those imposed by the UK. And in the UK, there were no criminal fines at all. And we've just done a bit of a rerun of that research. We found that just in the last 2 years, the US has imposed fines for money laundering 5.5 times the amount imposed in the UK. So it's 1.3 billion pounds worth of fines in the US on New York banks, compared to the UK, where it's just 236 million pounds, only civil fines. And there's a really important debate here about what stops this. Is it fines against companies, or is that just a cost of doing business, or do you go after the senior executives? One discussion that Margaret and I have had in lots of forums, and absolutely you have to do both. But I just want to give you two examples of, kleptocratic regimes where big banks were involved in the UK recently, which are outside of, they're from different areas. We got Goldman Sachs in the 1MDB case, a huge kleptocratic regime involving Malaysia and the looting of its national investment fund that was meant to fund development in Malaysia. Instead, the money was siphoned off into property, art, jets, a super yacht, and famously a Hollywood movie. And it was the London office of Goldman Sachs that booked these deals that were behind some of this kleptocracy and corruption. But it was the US Department of Justice that imposed criminal fines against Goldman of $2.9 billion. The UK regulators fined Goldman just 96.6 million in comparison, with no individuals held to account. Similar thing with Mozambique and the tuna bond scandal involving Credit Suisse, where it was the London office with bank employees from London who were involved in paying bribes to get bond deals. It's absolutely crippled the country and forced people into very extreme poverty. Now, these employees were based in the UK, and the Financial Conduct Authority found that there were senior individuals in the London unit who failed to even review external due diligence reports relating to these deals. Once again, US Department of Justice prosecuted the individuals, extradited them from the UK, imposed a criminal fine on Credit Suisse. The UK regulators imposed quite a hefty regulatory fine, but no individuals faced any action whatsoever. So, and it's not just the banks, we've seen this with big law firms, accountancy firms. They're not prosecuted for money laundering, they're not even prosecuted for the very, very simple offence of failing to report suspicious activity, as they are required by law to do. And we've been looking at some of the statistics around money laundering prosecutions, and they're absolutely tanking in the UK. So they've fallen from not a high amount, 27 in 2017 under the money laundering regulations, to 9 in 2020. And we've seen the same with criminal investigations by the HMRC, our tax body, and the Financial Conduct Authority. HMRC's criminal investigations into money laundering have halved in that period, and FCA investigations into companies for money laundering have gone from 14 to 3. So we've got basically a bit of an enforcement crisis which is providing very, very little deterrent in the UK. So the second reason is that basically when UK law enforcement does do investigations and prosecutions, it's hopelessly outgunned. And this was highlighted in the Russia report that Catherine mentioned earlier, which highlighted that the National Crime Agency, which is the kind of front line for the UK against money laundering, it's our national, it's meant to be the national FBI. The quote from the Russia report is, "It lacks the resources required. This must be rectified." This is what they said back in 2019. But far from being rectified, things have gone the wrong way. So research we're releasing shortly shows that the NCA's budget has actually declined by 4.2% in real terms over the past 5 years. And the most recent independent review of how NCA staff are paid shows that they continue to be paid less than the police, and that pay reform was increasingly urgently needed. So you have officers at the NCA who have very little experience of drawing up arrest warrants or doing investigations, who may have had just 3 days training going up against kleptocrats. But it's not just the pay and the lack of specialist expertise. We've got a system that is rigged against successful enforcement. And I think there's no clearer illustration of this than our McMafia orders, which were announced with huge ambition, particularly unexplained wealth orders, which have come to an absolute juddering halt because of the costs issue, which Maria was just referring to in relation to slap suits. And the Russia report was warned precisely of this. It said it's highly probable that the oligarchy will have the financial means to ensure their lawyers find ways to circumvent this legislation. That was back in 2019. And that's absolutely what's happened. So in the last unexplained wealth order involving a Kazakh politically exposed person, the National Crime Agency faced cost orders of £1.5 million against it, which had the potential to pretty much wipe out an investigative unit's budget for a year. And it's not just, Central Asia. We've seen this with a recent settlement the National Crime Agency did with Pakistan. And the Pakistani government came to the NCA and said, if you're going to go after this guy, this businessman in Pakistan, renowned for bribing every politician in the country, they said, if you don't settle with this guy, he is going to, quote, finish your prosecution budget. So there are some really big problems with costs. And that's the crossover with slaps, because what we see is that, the UK's army of lawyers, some of the best legal brains in the country, and perhaps even globally, are all targeted on defending kleptocracy rather than fighting it. And it's a real issue that we need to find something to do about. And it's very telling that the recently Department Lord Chancellor, who was head of the justice system in the UK, recently told an investigation by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism that the situation, quote, where one side has unlimited resources cannot be fair. And that very, very good investigation, which I recommend to anyone who hasn't read it, found that one company, the company that's been mentioned in relation to suing Tom Burgess, a Kazakh mining company, has spent the same amount in the last year on legal fees as the entire budget of the Serious Fraud Office, which is investigating it. So what's to be done about it? And it was really great to hear Maria's very, very concrete suggestions just then. I haven't even, talked about golden visas, which Maria raised, which is another really important issue. We're still waiting for the government to publish a report looking at all the golden visas it issued with absolutely no checks up to 2015. So we know who came into the country and who got citizenship. But moving, onto solutions, what do we do about it? So we desperately need a more even playing field between enforcement and those they're up against. In the same way we need that between journalists and enforcement. And that means, huge investment in law enforcement. It means making sure they can pay for the best legal advice. But we also need to find ways of making sure they're not subject to these huge costs where they've acted reasonably and properly. And I really like some of your suggestions, Maria, about devising legislation and making lawyers declare who they are actually defending. We definitely think we need much stronger protection against abusive tactics by lawyers that can really drain the public purse. They can make a case drag on for 2 years, taking endless minor point. And there isn't really the proper judicial management of these cases to protect against that in some cases. So there is some hope. The fact that, you know, the Summit for Democracy isn't just today. It doesn't end with our Prime Minister's YouTube clip, which had some, you know, as Margaret said, some suggestions of hope. It's a whole year of action. And we really need that year of action here in the UK, because we have quite a lot of catching up to do. And there is definitely an opportunity here. There'll be a whole new anti-corruption strategy being developed next year by the UK. And there is quite, you know, a lot of talk about whether we can get something around slaps and protection of journalists in that strategy. So that definitely is on the agenda. And I just want to kind of do a huge shout out to Susan Cottery and the FPC, who've done really, really amazing convening work in this country on the slaps issue, actually. And I think that, you know, NGOs like ourselves and Susan really keen to support, you know, we'll be on the end of it too, no doubt, you know, if we start naming names in the same way that investigative journalists do. But, you know, I think that finding ways that we can support the amazing work that people like Catherine and Casey and Maria do is really important, but we also need some fundamental policy changes. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Sue. I'm going to take, there's the questions actually in the chat, if that's all right, rather than they're now appearing in the Q&A, but I'm going to start with the chat, if I may. Thanks ever so much, Sue, for, you know, your usual really pointed contribution. And I'm going to go back to somebody who's joined us on this webinar from Vietnam. And I don't know if any of the panelists feel that they can take up what he's saying. I'm from Vietnam. Can you say a little about the topic of discussion today with the reality in Vietnam? I would love to know your thoughts. And I thought, you know, it was one of the stimulating things about this, the webinars, that we can be joined by people from across everywhere. So is there anybody who would like to respond to that from the panelists? Casey, you're looking as if you would, there's something you could say.
Well, I was going to say, unfortunately, I have to confess, I don't, I'm not a Southeast Asian expert, certainly not a Vietnam expert, and unfortunately, I'm not familiar with any primary case studies in which we have seen prominent Vietnamese nationals using and abusing some of these networks, some of these systems that we've seen develop. But I think within that is the kernel of truth that there's no reason that these specific or general Vietnamese oligarchic figures would not then use these same exact systems, tools, enabling services that we have been discussing, that we have been detailing, certainly as it pertains to the United Kingdom, or for that matter, the United States of America. These are widely open, widely available to any and every individual, oligarchic figure, kleptocratic figure, member of a ruling regime, or for that matter, the dictator, him or herself, to use and utilize. All of the incentives still remain for these specific figures, these businessmen and women, these oligarchs, anyone who has that little bit of dirty money burning holes in their pocket, and they want to file defamation suits, or they want to launder their money, or they want to access the finest lawyers and legal protections they can find to keep their assets safe for themselves, for their family members, or beyond that, to further launder reputations of themselves or the regime in question. There's no reason to think that there aren't a number of prominent Vietnamese, or for that matter, Malaysian or Cambodian, or you name it, examples that already exist that, again, I confess, unfortunately, I'm not familiar with. But that is not to say that they don't exist. In fact, there's every reason to think that there are a number of case studies that we have seen. Again, given the type of regime certainly that exists as it is in Vietnam, I would not be at all surprised if even just a bare bit of digging turns up both in the United Kingdom as well as in the United States a number of similar parallel networks using a number of similar parallel professional services, enablers, or in certain cases, maybe even specific firms themselves to help move, hide, and launder the money in question.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll find that. Can I just ask you a question? I was talking to somebody about trying to capping the costs both for enforcement agencies and indeed for action, vicious action that is taken against journalists. And I was told in America, you do have a better regime on that, and that on two grounds, that the costs are capped and in some case can't be claimed at all, and B, then if any costs are secured, they go to the enforcement agencies. So they rather than where there's a win, any of the costs secured there go to the enforcement agency, and therefore there's a financial incentive for the enforcement agencies to pursue and litigate against both corporations and individuals.
Yes, no, I unfortunately, Dame Margaret, I have to confess, I'm not familiar with the cap structure. I don't have any, unfortunately, details on that as it pertains to specific limits or specific caps. But absolutely, there is a financial incentivization as it pertains to leading prosecutions of, whether it's Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, that is to say the anti-bribery statute, anti-foreign bribery statute in the U.S., or the actual seizure of assets themselves. I will say, this is, again, to echo what I mentioned earlier, such a fertile time to be working in this space. It is such an innovative time, certainly at least in Washington, to be working in this space. There's bill after bill, discussion after discussion, policy proposal after policy proposal to shore up and to reframe, again, this incentivization structure, to remove these pro-kleptocracy underpinnings and policies and flip those on their head, patch up anti-money laundering holes, and then to pursue policies that actually incentivize the pursuit of those ill-gotten gains and kleptocratic wealth. One proposed bill currently being debated in Congress would specifically take, as memory serves, I don't have the details in front of me, as memory serves, 5 or maybe 10% of all fines received from the successful prosecutions of, again, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act prosecutions in the United States of America. And again, that is the primary anti-foreign bribery tool. So it would take a significant, relatively significant amount of those specific awards, those specific prosecutions, and turn those to funding specific anti-corruption policies in partner countries elsewhere, especially in transitioning democracy, in places like Moldova, in places like Ukraine, or even in places like Armenia just a few years ago. It would take a specific slice of those fines incurred and dedicate those not just to the basic underpinnings of the functioning of the Department of Treasury or the investigators themselves, but also to specific anti-corruption policy platforms in transitioning partner countries elsewhere. So that may be a bit disappointing response to your question, Dame Margaret, all of which is to say this is one of the key elements and pillars being discussed in Washington right now about reframing how it is that you incentivize and fund and structure. Because what Sue mentioned just a moment ago, if the U.S. does have a strength within this broader fight against kleptocracy, it is in enforcement. And I don't see that going away anytime soon. It's a clear laggard as it pertains to regulatory oversight. But when it comes to enforcement, when it comes to actual action in terms of targeting and prosecuting these figures, the U.S. has a clear strength in that space, and that will continue for the foreseeable future.
Right. Does anybody else want to add to that? I'm going to go to the Q&A. I know there are some in the chat too, but it's difficult to decide where to go. So I'm following my instructions. So the first one's from Ewan Grant, who's I think I've met before on webinars, a former UK Customs Service intelligence analyst, and he asks, how are Switzerland, EU member states and central EU bodies, such as the new EPPO, reaching out to USA and the UK on better coordination and enforcement? Can anybody deal with that one? Sorry, I have to keep turning it off. Does anybody know? Can anybody respond to that? Not really. I think we're showing a little bit of ignorance on that. There's a question to me there of what are the main lobbyist arguments against enforcing more financial transparency in the UK? And I think the answer is they're just making too much money out of it, all of them, the enablers, and particularly the enablers. So I think that's the greatest. The banks, even with the SARs that they have to produce. I mean, they fill in their SARs and then they carry on laundering the ill-gotten gains of kleptocrats across the world, and feel that just because they've done the bureaucratic thing of filling in the SARs, they don't have to do anything else. There's just too much money at stake. There is too, I don't know if anybody wants to add to that, really. I mean, that's my analysis of it. And I have to say, a recent analysis we've done of one Russian kleptocrat who is present here in the UK. I think he's funding over 30, I may be wrong on the actual figure, but over 30 government politicians and their local parties, so that he's buying the influence, which will then stop anybody taking action against them. That's in answer to Stanislav's question to me. I'm going to go to Stephen. When politicians and lawyers in the UK are so mistrusted, what hope is there that the public will believe that anything serious will be done to take on the city? Unexplained wealth orders have proved to be a sick joke. Hypocrisy may be a Greek word, but the British have turned it into an art form. I'm afraid I agree with Stephen. Does anybody want to comment on that? Catherine, Sue, anybody? Maria, anybody? Sue?
Yep. Well,
I agree with him.
yeah. What can you say? I mean, I think it's really hard, because I think there are, how someone's put something about in the chat function about how do you attract the best legal talent to law enforcement. And I think that's what the US does really well, because it is actually really sexy to go and be a district attorney or, you know, FBI, or, but it, you know, it doesn't, like the Crown Prosecution Service and the SFO. I mean, the SFO did have a bit of that for a while, but it doesn't have that. This is sexy, you know, I want to spend my life doing that. It does attract, but they attract really, really great people who are really, really dedicated. And then it becomes this vicious cycle that, you know, when you lose, like the NCA lost on that unexplained wealth order, which pretty much stopped unexplained wealth orders in their tracks, you know, they get hammered by everyone. They get told that they're rubbish, and, you know, then who's going to want to go and work there? You know, it's kind of, so we're in quite a vicious downward cycle. Don't know if that answers the question, but
yeah, that's very helpful. I was going to go to a really interesting question from Rosalind Bain, which Maria and might answer, and Catherine could answer. Oh, I've lost the question now. I've got to get it back up again. How does enforcement for transparency in the UK and the US help Democrats in Russia? I think that's a really interesting question. Catherine, do you want to start on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it would help Democrats in Russia a great deal, because part of what we've seen sort of Putin's game in the last couple of years since he annexed Crimea has been to try and boost his standing and increase Russia's influence by undermining other Western democracies who he sees as his rivals, as I mentioned before. Instead of competing directly through building a strong competitive economy, he prefers to use the cash flows at his command to try and buy off and corrupt individuals, officials, and institutions in the West so that they can support his power back home. And I guess we've seen this very clearly in one very specific example, and that's in Nord Stream 2. Like, we know, for instance, that Putin has been able to enact and kind of utilize a network of enablers and lobbyists in the West that have backed the construction of this pipeline, which is really key to sort of Putin's revenue stream, key to the Russian budget, and also key to his projection of power, because it allows Russia to bypass Ukraine. It allows him, therefore, to now threaten Ukraine in a way that he's trying to sort of prop up his own power at home as well. So all these lobbyists which have supported Nord Stream 2, the gas pipeline through into Germany along the way, including Gerhard Schröder, the former Chancellor of Germany, who is a big backer of the project and serves on its board. These are all people who are essentially helping prop up Putin's regime. They're keeping the money flowing into the Kremlin coffers. And as I was talking to sort of one banker quite recently, who's definitely a Russian banker, who's definitely very liberal minded and wants to see change from the stagnation and the repression of Putin's rule. And he says, really, the only way that we in the West now can support the Democrats is really to find a way to, one, stop Nord Stream, 2, cut off their energy flow. So the more we can impinge his lobbying tactics abroad and his influence campaigns abroad, the more it's possible to assist Democrats and try and sort of undercut Putin's power at home and his attempts to project it abroad, because that also, in his eyes, helps bolster his status as well.
Yeah. I wish they thought about all that, Catherine, before deciding that they're going to engage in some sort of warfare over the Ukraine, which
it's a bit late.
It's a bit, I know. Maria, can you add anything to that? I think it's a really question.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just echoing what Catherine just said, is really kind of going. It's quite simple. It's going after the money, right? So it's investigating who has what influence, and just making sure that they don't have access to money that is mostly kept abroad, and that would significantly help those kind of healthy powers that I wouldn't probably call democratic, but there are oppositional forces in Russia that are much more constructive than the current regime. I mean, so far, Magnitsky sanctions were by far the most effective tool against all these kleptocrats and all the criminals who were responsible for killing Magnitsky in prison and for enabling this situation to happen. So these sanctions need to be enhanced, and they need to be applied against this type of criminals. And of course, we in Justice for Journalists Foundation insist that this type of sanctions are imposed against people responsible for prosecution of journalists.
Yeah. I agree with all that, and the further work we can do around the Magnitsky sanctions is really important. And I think it's been an incredibly powerful campaign. I'm going to James Hatt's question. If you can see it in the chat, everybody, could we touch on how arbitration mechanisms allow kleptocrats to hire the cream of the legal profession to vigorously argue over the ownership of stolen state assets with impunity as to what they disclose about each other under the roof of confidentiality? Somehow we need to withdraw these secret forums from being abused, as the issue should be in open court. I think there's one thing about open court, there's another about lawyers taking on these cases. I mean, we have a strong sort of cab rank rule tradition here in the UK, where everybody has the right to legal representation. It's and it mitigates the difficulty with this whole area, is it mitigates against that very important principle, unless I've read it wrong. Who would like to take that on? Yeah, Sue.
I'm really glad that James has raised this, because actually this is since we're on Anti-Corruption Day, we need hope rather than despair. There is an important consultation that the Law Commission is now doing on the UK's Arbitration Act. And this is like really key issue, because just a really clear case going on at the moment of that abuse is an extraordinary case involving Nigeria, where a really small offshore company based in the British Virgin Islands basically sued the Nigerian government, having paid bribes essentially to win a contract. And then the contract didn't go anywhere. And Nigeria now owes this tiny company, which no one really knows who owns it, $10 billion. And Nigeria have now scrabbled around and said, we've got the evidence of the corruption, but that would have all been heard behind closed doors. And I think we really need a rule where corruption is involved, it has to go into open court. And we need much stronger checks on those people hearing arbitration cases, But we found, looking at this, we've done quite a bit of research into this, that the UK courts are very desperate to stay the centre of global arbitration. And so they tend to support the idea that contracts should be enforced at any cost, rather than looking at whether corruption or fraud might have undermined that contract. So it's a really, really important issue. And it's also, you see it with money laundering. I mean, there have been constant allegations in the UK courts of people, and we looking at a case at the moment where, you've got basically an oligarch and his business person engaged in an arbitral dispute, which clearly looks like an attempt to launder the money because the businessman's on the sanctions list, and he's trying to put it in someone else's name. So I think it's a really important issue, and I really think that this Law Commission review is an opportunity. We shouldn't leave it to the arbitral lawyers to use this opportunity to get what they want. We need a bit of a campaign to open up the arbitration courts.
Right, that sounds to me like something else I've got to get involved in. I'm going to move to Matt Anderson, who says on the Q&A, apart from lots and lots of thanks to you all in both the chat and the Q&A, it was mentioned before that we in the UK are poor at enforcement despite the law. Why is this? Is there a deeper problem in British society than is perhaps addressable through legislation? I think that's probably either Catherine or Sue again, I'm afraid. Or Maria, do feel free to come in on that. Go on, Sue. I think
I would answer just very quickly from the point of view of what we've seen from the Tory party and their reluctance to even publish the Russia report about the scale of Russian influence in UK politics. And that does really point to a very kind of deep-seated malaise that they don't even want to look at that problem, and part of it comes from security services reluctance to look at kind of anything involving political activities. We saw that in the findings of the Russia report on the lack of investigation into Brexit, and the security services just didn't want to touch it with a barge pole because they deemed it interference in the political process, when really that's such kind of cat-handed thinking, when these are potential threats from potentially hostile states trying to influence your democracies. We should be all over it. But I think that's recognised now, but we see the Tory party still reluctant to address any of the findings, and we've seen sort of more and more come out sort of after the FinCEN files and the Pandora Papers, for instance, about Lubov Chernuchin, who is a major donor to the Tory party. And yet in the Pandora Papers, it's shown that most of her money comes from her husband, who's a former deputy finance minister and, is still in business with Kremlin-linked people to this day, which means that he's open and vulnerable to Kremlin influence and so on. And yet the Tory party just has its head in the sand attitude and refuses to look at it. And I don't know quite why that is, why these are such important sources of funding, or whether it's some kind of deep-seated it was at the Chatham House presentation of their kleptocracy problem report last night, that was also said that this is kind of when your country is being run by a very rich ruling elite. They just kind of believe that they shouldn't look into these type of problems at all. But I don't know. I think obviously we need sort of more pressure on these issues. But I'll leave that to Susan and Maria to speak about.
Susan, Sue.
I mean, that absolutely is a key point. Catherine and Margaret, you've made it in the past as well, but it is extraordinary, isn't it, that there isn't more concern and outrage about this, that foreign, particularly given all the Brexit talk and taking back control, that some of our legislators and our politicians are essentially in the pocket of some very, very bad people, who don't have our national interests at heart, in fact have the opposite. And you do think, how can we make people care about that actually? Like, is it that it's just too big an issue you know, or the press, you know, aren't interested enough about it. But it just seems extraordinary that, you know, that could be the case, and it could be so fundamentally damaging to our democracy. And like you say, Catherine, that the intelligence services don't have a proper role, and we don't have anything like you saw, like the Mueller investigation in the US, which comes back to enforcement. You actually do not have in the UK, and you see it again and again at the moment, like every time there's a question about, you know, whether there's been corruption in government, which police force in the UK, you know, or which body is genuinely independent and powerful enough to actually investigate those in power? And we just don't have one.
Yeah, Mark, can I jump in for just one moment? I was going to say, Sue, in terms of generating public interest and outrage, certainly a wonderful way to do that is to have a president like Donald Trump for 4 years. That has certainly paid dividends for any range of policies here in the United States of America, least of all illicit financial flows, especially foreign financial links. Sue, I did want to ask one question just a moment ago to get back to the initial question. Again, we were talking about the relationship between U.S. and U.K., regulatory oversight, and then enforcement beyond that. And again, the relative strengths of both. And maybe this is, you know, further research in the future. Where does the UK compare, not to the US itself, but to jurisdictions like the European Union, places like Canada, maybe even places like Australia? Is it, I know that I think the questioner phrased it, it's a relative weakness for the UK, certainly relative to the US, but does that hold also for relative to Brussels or to Ottawa or Canberra as well?
I mean, I think it depends on the jurisdiction. So I think if you look at, so recently, some of the amazing work done by the FT on Wirecard, you know, resulting in German police going and not bashing down the doors of the Ministry of Finance. You just wouldn't have that in the UK. There is no police that would go and bash down the doors of a government body. And, you know, that's the extraordinary thing. So I think Europe is catching up. I don't think it's been that great. I think it has had a real problem. But if you look at, you know, Germany, its new Corporate Sanctions Act, but it's a good question, because I don't think, you know, as David Lewis, who had a FATF, said before he left, no one's doing that well, you know. And so that's the trouble, is that, you know, when the UK turns around and goes, we are the best in the world, you know, we're not, but it, you know, there aren't many brilliant jurisdictions that do better. So I know you do better enforcement, you know, in the US, but you're only just subjecting lawyers to money laundering regulations, which is kind of slightly mind-blowing, isn't it? But we have them subject to money laundering regulations, but we just don't do anything really about it.
The only thing I would add to that, Sue, is I think the European Union itself is now taking much more of an interest, and that, I think, will have an impact on Europe. And the other, my experience of looking at all the major leaks, you know, that there have been over the last decade or so, about not just, you know, about tax evasion, tax avoidance, as well as financial crime and money laundering. We are very often, Sue, at the bottom of that list. I think of, for example, the leaks that came out of the Swiss bank, the Falciani leaks on HSBC, where we're often the most cited in terms of clients or companies or whatever it is, taking advantage of ill-doing. But then you look at who is pursued through the courts, and we too often come bottom of the league. So I think we are very poor there, and I think it's a mix of lack of funding, but I also think there isn't a political will. If there were political leadership on these issues, you would get further. We're getting to the end. I'm going to end this with a rather good question from, I hope I pronounced it, Subin Kim, who we haven't talked about offshore, but how do we make offshore uncool when TV shows keep glamorizing it, and enablery type careers promise the most financial comfort for young people? We haven't talked a lot about offshore, so I thought it'd be an opportunity, because we're running out of time. Can you, I'm going to go to all of you to answer this, and then hopefully you can link in your final comments with an answer to that. And I'm going to start with you, Maria. May I do that?
Right. I think my answer will be very short to that. I think Pandora Papers and investigative journalists who, like OCRP and others who worked on these investigations. They did, and of course the whistleblowers who dig out this information and shared it with the journalists. I think this is what is making this, as we speak, is making the offshore and all the murky kind of business mechanisms very, very uncool at the moment.
I'm going to share with you one thought, because it is often said that the economies of lots of these offshore jurisdictions is dependent on their secrecy and what they do. And I will always remember the hurricanes in the British Virgin Isles. And anybody who saw the pictures of those on their television screen, the British Virgin Islands is the worst, I think for me, the worst offender in facilitating both secrecy and financial crime and all sorts of terrible things. And if you looked at those pictures after the hurricane, the idea that any of that wealth that was illicitly gained through their role, any of that trickled down anywhere close to any of the people living in poverty in those islands, it was a joke. None of it. You looked at the shacks in which the people who suffered from the hurricane lived, and you thought, where the hell is the wealth that you've grabbed here from illicit activity benefiting your local population? Never. But that's a prejudice of mine. Casey, I'm going to go to you, offshore, and your final thoughts.
Sure. Thanks, Dame Margaret. I mean, I as I'm sure viewers may be able to tell, I'm far from any expert in what pertains to be cool or not cool for that matter. But I will say, again, we do have television shows, we have advertising campaigns, et cetera, that have spent years and years glamorizing these figures, these networks, these enabling professionals, and that is not going to change, at least in the short term. But I will say, maybe this is a conversation for another time. Maybe this is misplaced. It does seem, as we have increasing investigations, as we have increasing discussions, even just this week, as we have things like the Summit for Democracy, and certainly in the U.S., prominent American officials highlighting the damage that these networks have done. It does. I would say this: it would not surprise me if we look back at this period as one of the beginning of a generational change in addressing international finance, the broader international financial architecture that has incentivized, created, and expanded and entrenched these illicit financial networks. And we look back at this kind of maybe 3-decade-long period after the end of the Cold War and after the collapse of the Soviet Union as a specific era, a specific model that we can now begin to see the clear failures of. And beyond that, the national security concerns within. This is maybe a positive outlook on where things may go. Certainly, there are any number of detours and that we can take between now and whatever potential future point that might make. But maybe let's check in 10 years or 15 years and see what is cool, and see whether or not these shows and these advertising campaigns and these brand opportunities, et cetera, whether those remain, or if we look back to things like the 1980s as we do now and say, well, there was a clear crassness there were clear failures there, and there was a clear detriment to broader societal underpinnings that were a clear outcome of that deregulatory atmosphere. It's possible that we look back in 30 years' time at this period and realize this is when the change came. This is when we first began identifying the issues and finding those solutions, and beyond that, being able to implement those solutions both nationally and internationally. So maybe that's hopefully a little bit of a hopeful comment to end on.
I love your optimism, Casey. I think you've got a Joe Biden. We need our Joe Biden.
Thank you.
But he has done brilliantly as well on the international agreements around the OECD agreements, shifting of profit shifting. Not
Absolutely.
as wanted, but I never thought it would happen in my time. Catherine, to you.
I would just say then we should have more TV shows about how cool Casey Michel is in writing his books, hunting down the kleptocrats.
I don't think there'd be many viewers for that, but thank you, Catherine.
More films and TV programs about sort of the efforts of journalists at the OCCRP and the ICIJ, who are obviously doing so much to unmask how these enablers operate, and obviously more power and funding to law enforcement, so people can see how really cool these crooks are when they land in jail. I mean, what else can I say?
Well, that's brilliant. I agree with all that too. And finally, to Sue.
Yeah, great question. We need to make enabling kleptocracies as socially unacceptable as smoking. So we need like the whole new generation of TikTokers to come up with some really good memes that that make that socially unacceptable. And I agree, but I agree with what Catherine just said, because actually the McMafia program in the UK was really foundational in changing the narrative and grabbing people's consciousness, and people do care about it. Like, when the first UWO against Haji Ava happened, apparently it was the most read story on the BBC. Like, people were really fascinated. But I think the trouble is people are fascinated by that wealth and the inequality, aren't they? So, yeah, how can we tackle the inequality that is under it as well? Is a really important question.
Well, I'm going to end you with a positive thing that actually I think this isn't in the UK context. This is not necessarily a partisan issue, that there is anger at illicit finance and right across the political domain, the hatred of the illicit finance from Russia that comes into the economy is not isn't a left-right issue. It just touches a lot of people. And I think our task, I feel my task, is to try and raise the profile of the issue as much as we can through politics, but we need to work with you. And I'm going to end on this. So I think there is opportunity there. I share a bit of the optimism. I don't think this isn't something which hits party politics. It's something that makes most people really angry, and all what we have to do is raise awareness. But can I end with enormous respect, gratitude to the four of you for the work you're doing. I know that without your efforts, we wouldn't even be at the starting point. So I look forward to working with you over the coming period. And I know there are others who really value your contribution. And I'm sure all of those on the webinar today, and you can see from the from what we've had in really do in the chat, have really valued what you have all said. So keep working. Keep the optimism. I think that's really important. And let's cooperate. I think the cooperation across jurisdictions is absolutely central to us understanding the best tactics and the best changes that we need to bring an end to the evil in our society of kleptocracy. Thank you very, very much, all of you. Thank you. And good night. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you.